Janice Reynolds had never imagined herself standing beneath the crystal chandeliers of Ashbourne Estate. At 62 years old, her life had been a quiet succession of early mornings, worn mop handles, and the soft hum of vacuum cleaners in modest suburban homes. But when the offer came from a cleaning agency for a part-time position at one of the oldest and most prestigious estates in Massachusetts, she accepted without hesitation. She needed the extra money, yes, but something about the name Ashbourne rang faintly in the back of her mind, like a memory not yet formed. The estate loomed over the landscape, 3 stories high, carved in stone with towering windows and thick ivy curling around its ancient bones. The driveway stretched longer than any she had ever seen, flanked by perfectly trimmed hedges and tall, mute statues. As she arrived that first morning, the silence of the place unnerved her. There were no birds, no distant cars, only the heavy creak of the front door when Charles, the butler, opened it to greet her. He was an older gentleman, perhaps in his early 70s, tall and angular, with eyes that betrayed no emotion. He introduced himself with a voice as smooth and polished as the floor tiles, and gave her a brief tour of the main floor. The east wing, he said, was off limits. "It has not been in use for years," he remarked, almost mechanically. "There is no need to clean there." Janice did not question it. She was not the type to pry. Her job was to clean, not to poke around places she was not meant to be. And so, for the first 3 days, she stuck to the vast hallways, the drawing rooms filled with antique furniture, and the endless collection of books in the library. Everything smelled faintly of cedar and lemon polish. The household staff was minimal. Charles, a young maid named Amelia, who barely spoke, and a private chef who arrived only on weekends. Mr. Ashbourne himself kept to his study or left the city most days, his presence more ghost than man. On the 4th morning, a thin drizzle swept across the estate grounds as Janice arrived with her umbrella and lunchbox. She was early, as always, and the quiet pressing around her even more than usual. The halls were empty, the maid nowhere in sight, and Charles had not greeted her. She assumed they were busy elsewhere in the house. She began her routine in the dining room, working her way across the wooden floors with slow, careful strokes. The silence was complete, broken only by the faint swish of her mop and the occasional creak of floorboards. When she made her way toward the western corridor, something caught her eye, a cobweb dangling near a sconce by the end of the hall. She reached up at her duster, but as she did, she noticed the adjoining doorway. It was the entrance to the east wing. The door was ajar, just slightly, barely enough to catch a glimpse of the room beyond. Had someone gone inside? Was it Amelia, perhaps? Or had Charles finally decided it was time to air it out? Janice stood there unsure, her hand frozen midair. She remembered the warning, but it had not sounded ominous, just routine. Off limits, he had said. Not forbidden. Not dangerous. Just unused. Still, she hesitated. Her eyes traveled back to the cobweb, now fluttering gently as if in encouragement. She took a step closer, then another. The silence in the house was complete. No footsteps, no voices, just a faint, persistent patter of rain against the windows. She reached for the door. The wood was smooth beneath her hand, cool and dry. She pushed it open with the smallest amount of pressure, and the door swung in without a sound. The room was dim, the curtains drawn, allowing only slivers of pale light to cut across the floor. Dust danced in the beams like tiny spirits. The room was large and impeccably preserved, with high ceilings and dark wooden panels along the walls. The smell was different here, older, mustier, as though time itself had settled in and refused to leave. She stepped inside. There was something solemn about the space. A piano stood in the corner, its keys covered. A heavy armchair faced a large stone fireplace. Books were stacked neatly on side tables, and a globe sat half-turned beside a velvet chaise. But it was a far wall that made her stop breathing. There, hanging alone between 2 tall windows, was a portrait. Janice felt her chest tighten as she stepped closer. The canvas was large, perhaps 4 feet in height, and framed in a deep, ornate gold. The boy in the painting was no older than 10, dressed in a formal suit with gentle, almost serene expression. His hair was dark, slightly tousled. his skin pale. But it was the eyes that struck her most, hazel, soft kind. Something inside her broke loose, like a drawer opening after decades sealed shut. She knew that face. She had seen it every day for 2 years at Mill Creek Orphanage, back when she worked there as a caretaker in her 30s. The boy's name was Eli. He had been quiet, polite, always drawing in his little notebook with red crayons. He liked birds. He hated thunder. He used to sit by the window and ask questions no one his age should ask. She remembered the day he disappeared, taken abruptly by a man in a black coat. No paperwork, no warning. Just gone. Her hands began to tremble. She backed away from the portrait, eyes wide, heart pounding. A muffled voice called her name, Janice, but it sounded far away, like it was being spoken through water. She turned and saw Mr. Ashbourne standing in the doorway, and before she could stop herself, the words came out in a hoarse whisper, filled with something deeper than shock. "Sir, this boy lived with me in the orphanage." Mr. Ashbourne stood in the doorway like a shadow made solid, his eyes fixed on Janice with mix of curiosity and suspicion. He was impeccably dressed, as always, dark gray slacks, a navy vest, sleeves rolled crisply to the elbows, as if he had just stepped out of a board meeting. But his expression betrayed no warmth. He was not the kind of man who softened, not even in moments of confusion or confrontation. Janice stood trembling, the air in the room thick with the weight of what she had just said. Her voice had cracked as she spoke, but the words were unmistakable. She didn't move, didn't dare look at the portrait again. "I beg your pardon?" Mr. Ashbourne said, taking a step forward, his shoes silent on the old wooden floor. "What did you just say?" Janice swallowed. Her voice was steadier now, though her knees felt weak. "That boy, in the painting, he lived in the orphanage where I worked. His name was Eli. I remember him." Mr. Ashbourne's eyes flicked toward the portrait briefly, then back to her. His expression hardened, but there was something beneath it, something cautious, perhaps even defensive. "That portrait has been here for decades," he said. "It's nothing more than a piece of art. The artist used a composite of features from several children. No one specific." Janice shook her head. "No, sir. I knew him. I talked to him. I watched him draw, helped him with schoolwork. I remember the day he disappeared. I never forgot him." Silence settled again. Mr. Ashbourne stepped past her, approaching the painting. He examined it for a long moment, then turned his back to it as if it no longer held any significance. "Mrs. Reynolds, I appreciate your work here," he said with measured tone, "but I don't think it's appropriate to project personal memories onto this household. The portrait is a family heirloom." Janice blinked. "He's not part of your family." His gaze narrowed slightly. "You don't know that." It wasn't a threat, but it was not a threat either. "I'd like you to leave this room now," he added, gesturing toward the hallway. Her instincts screamed at her to say more, to press him, to demand answers. But something in his tone told her it would be useless. "Not here. Not now." She nodded, slowly stepping back through the doorway. As she crossed the threshold, she dared one last glance at the boy in the portrait. His eyes seemed different now, more sorrowful. Or perhaps it was just the weight of what she had remembered. The door shut behind her. That afternoon, Janice worked quietly, the soft on the vacuum cleaner barely masking the questions circling her mind. She noticed Charles watching her from the far end of the hallway once or twice, standing still like a statue. He said nothing, but his presence felt heavier than usual. By the time her shift ended, the rain had stopped, and the sky outside had faded into a pale, somber gray. She walked to her car slowly, each step dragging with the weight of what she had seen. She didn't drive home immediately. Instead, she sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, staring at the mansion through the rear-view mirror, trying to piece together something that made sense. Back in her small apartment, Janice moved like someone sleepwalking. She placed her keys on the table, hung up her coat, and went straight to the closet in the hallway. It had been years since she'd opened the old metal box that sat on the top shelf, buried beneath linens and winter scarves. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked the latches. Inside were journals, Dozens of them. She pulled out the one marked with the year that Eli had arrived at the orphanage. Over 30 years ago now. The pages were yellowing, some curling at the edges, but her handwriting was still legible. She flipped through the pages slowly until she found what she was looking for. March 20th. Eli arrived today. He's very quiet. I don't think he speaks much. Hazel eyes. A little notebook he clutches like it's all he owns in the world. Her breath caught as she turned the page. June 12th. He asked if birds knew when they were being watched. I told him probably not. He seemed disappointed. Then he laughed. October 7th. A man came. No warning. Took Eli. Said it was a private adoption. No paperwork. Mrs. Lennox said not to ask questions. I wanted to scream. The ink was smeared here. She remembered crying when she wrote it. Janice dug further into the box and found the old photo, faded but still clear. Eli standing on the orphanage steps, arms folded, a paper crane tucked behind one ear. She had taken the photo herself with a disposable camera. She had nearly forgotten it existed. Holding it now, with the memory of the portrait still burning in her mind, there was no doubt left. The boy in the photo and the boy on the wall were the same. She stayed up most of the night, pacing, rereading her journals, scanning the photo under different lights as if the details would change. But they didn't. And as dawn crept through the blinds, a thought crystallized in her mind. Mr. Ashbourne had lied. The boy in that portrait was real. And Janice wasn't going to let that truth disappear quietly. The next morning, she returned to the mansion as scheduled. Charles opened the door as he always did, but something in his demeanor had changed. He didn't greet her, just stepped aside and let her in. She nodded politely, trying not to let on how much she had uncovered. As she passed the staircase, she noticed Amelia coming out of the parlor with a tray of empty glasses. The young maid looked startled when she saw Janice, almost guilty. She opened her mouth to say something, but Charles appeared behind them both. "You are needed in the main hallway," he said to Janice. His voice clipped. "The rugs need attention." Janice nodded and walked away without a word, but her heart was pounding. She spent the next few hours working slowly, listening for sounds, watching for signs. Nothing more was said about the portrait, and Mr. Ashbourne did not appear again. But Janice could feel it, an unspoken tension in the air, as though her presence had disrupted something carefully hidden. By the time she left that afternoon, she had made up her mind. She would return to the orphanage, what remained of it, and try to find out more. She would contact the old director. If she was still alive, someone had to remember what happened to Eli. Someone besides her. And if no one did, she would dig until they did. The truth was somewhere in that mansion, frozen in oil paint and gold frame. And she wasn't going to stop until she uncovered every last piece of it. 3 days passed in a slow, tense rhythm. Janice continued working at the Ashbourne estate, but nothing felt the same. Every polished surface, every silent hallway, every glance from Charles felt laced with warning. She no longer trusted the stillness of the place. It was too deliberate, too rehearsed, like a stage where the actors pretended not to notice that something unscripted had happened. Mr. Ashbourne did not speak to her again during those days. He moved through the estate like a specter, appearing and disappearing without announcement, always with his eyes cast elsewhere. The portrait room remained locked. Charles never mentioned it, nor did Amelia. But Janice had the distinct feeling that they were all waiting to see if she would stir the dust again. On the morning of the 4th day, Janice arrived early, half an hour before her scheduled shift. She stood at the edge of the estate's long driveway, watching the mansion in the pale morning light. Something told her that the time for quiet speculation had passed. It was time to confront the man at the center of it all. She walked with purpose through the front door, startling Charles, who had not expected her so soon. He opened his mouth to speak, but she brushed past him without a word. Her steps echoed down the main hallway as she headed directly for the study, Mr. Ashbourne's sanctuary. The door was closed. She knocked once, firmly. No answer. She turned the knob. The room inside was dimly lit, the curtains drawn halfway. Shelves of leather-bound books lined the walls, and the scent of old paper and sandalwood lingered in the air. Mr. Ashbourne sat behind a broad mahogany desk, his hands folded in front of him, as though he'd been expecting her all along. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said without looking up, "you are early." Janice stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her. "I need to talk to you. I assumed you might." There was a long pause. He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. She remained standing. "I know who that boy is," she said, "and I know you're lying." He finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "I already told you." Janice cut him off. "You said the portrait was a composite, that the artist made up the face. But I remember him. I worked with him every day for 2 years. I found his name in my journals. I found photograph. You can't tell me he's no one." Mr. Ashbourne's gaze sharpened, but he did not raise his voice. "Mrs. Reynolds, I do not know what memories you are revisiting, but I assure you, your conclusions are misguided. I'm not confused. I remember Eli. I remember how he disappeared. No one ever explained why. There were no records, no adoption papers, nothing. And now, I find his portrait on your wall." Mr. Ashbourne stood, slowly, his hands resting on the back of the chair. "I don't appreciate being accused of dishonesty in my own home." "I'm not accusing," she said, her voice steady now. "I'm stating what I know. That boy existed, and you know it." He walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside just slightly to let in more light. His profile was tense, his jaw clenched. "There are things you do not understand. Then help me understand them." He turned to face her fully now. "You're asking questions that have no good answers. Let it go." Janice met his stare. "I can't." Silence again. A long, quiet standoff. Then, to her surprise, he sat back down, fingers steepled under his chin. "Many years ago." He began slowly. "My father was a complicated man, a scientist, among other things. He believed in legacy, in influence, in control. He had many eccentric interests, some of which brought him into contact with private institutions and orphanages. He believed talent could be found in the most unlikely places." Janice's throat went dry. She didn't interrupt. "There was a time," he continued, "when certain arrangements were made. Children were selected for observation, behavior, intellect, emotional response. My father wanted to prove something. That potential could be measured and shaped. I didn't understand much of it at the time. I was young, but I remember one boy. He was different, quiet, brilliant, even then. I never knew his name, only that my father insisted he was special." "Eli," Janice said softly. Mr. Ashbourne hesitated. "I don't know what became of him. One day he was gone, just like that. My father never spoke of it again." "Are you saying your father took him from the orphanage?" "I'm saying he was involved, as were others. I don't have records. I don't have answers. And frankly, Mrs. Reynolds, I have spent most of my life trying to forget that part of our family's past." Janice stepped closer to the desk. "But the portrait, why keep it?" He sighed. "It arrived shortly after my father died. No note, no artist's signature, just a canvas. At first, I didn't even recognize the boy, but something about it, I kept it, perhaps as a reminder, or a penance." She narrowed her eyes. "You recognize him. You knew. You just didn't want to admit it." Mr. Ashbourne said nothing. Janice exhaled slowly. "I'm not here to destroy your family name. I just want to know what happened to him." "I don't know. I don't believe that." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "No." His gaze was cold, calculating. "Then tread carefully, Mrs. Reynolds. There are people who don't want this history resurfaced. People who were part of those arrangements. Powerful people. You may think this is about a portrait or a boy you once knew, but it is much bigger than that, much older, and far more dangerous. I'm not afraid of the truth. You should be." She held his stare for a long moment, then turned and walked out. The rest of the day passed in a fog. Janice worked in silence, her mind racing with possibilities. If Mr. Ashbourne was telling the truth or at least part of it, then Eli had been part of some kind of experiment, a program. And it hadn't been just one man's obsession. There were others, a system, a network. By the time she left that evening, she had made a decision. She would start digging, not just into the orphanage's records, but into anyone connected to the Ashbourne name, medical grants, academic papers, any public trace of the project Mr. Ashbourne had alluded to. If the truth had been buried, she would become the shovel, and she would not stop digging until she found Eli, or what was left of him. The week that followed unfolded in a whirlwind of old contacts, dusty archives, and sleepless nights. Janice had never thought of herself as a detective, but something inside her had shifted permanently. The fragile peace she once lived with had been broken the moment she saw Eli's portrait, and now it was as if every unasked question of the past had begun to rise, demanding an answer. She wasn't just seeking truth anymore. She was chasing justice for a boy whose life had been quietly erased. She began with Mill Creek Orphanage, the place where she had worked for over a decade before it shut down. The building itself was long gone, replaced by a parking structure on the edge of the city. But Janice remembered the address of the county office that handled adoption and institutional records. She went in person, arriving just after opening hours, a folder of her old journals clutched to her chest. The clerk behind the desk, a young woman with dark-rimmed glasses and an indifferent smile, typed half-heartedly as Janice explained her reason for visiting. "We don't typically give out information unless you're a legal guardian or a direct relative," she said without looking up, "and especially not for closed facilities." Janice laid a copy of the photograph on the counter. He was never adopted. There were no papers. He disappeared. His name was Eli. This is him. The woman sighed, then looked down at the photo. Her brow furrowed slightly. "You said Mill Creek?" "Yes. Let me check something." She disappeared into a back room, leaving Janice standing in silence, the air thick with government-issue bleach and dust. After what felt like an eternity, the clerk returned with a slim file in her hand. "This is all we have on record. Most of the physical documents were lost when the building was cleared, but there was one page digitally archived under unusual circumstances." She placed the page on the counter and turned it around. It was a list, typed sparse, no more than 24 names. First names only, with arrival dates and coded annotations. Janice's heart jumped when she saw Eli, 10/14, MC 17. There was a red stamp beside it that read, "Transferred." No date, no destination. "What does MC 17 mean?" Janice asked. "No idea," the clerk replied. "Probably an internal ID. But look, most of the other names have exit dates. Adoption, family reunification, even juvenile detention in one case. But Eli's just says transferred. That's it. No paper trail. No digital record of where." Janice stared at the page, every nerve in her body tensing. "Can I make a copy?" "Technically, no. But I didn't see anything," the clerk said, walking away. Back in her apartment, Janice laid the page beside her journals. A pattern had begun to form. She pulled out more notebooks, flipping through them until she came to the weeks before Eli had been taken. She had written about an increase in visits from official-looking men. She remembered one in particular, a tall man in a gray overcoat who never gave a name, only showed up to speak with the orphanage director in closed-door meetings. She had assumed back then that they were inspectors. Now she wasn't so sure. That night, Janice had a dream. She was back in the hallway at Mill Creek, and Eli was standing at the end, waving at her. But when she tried to run toward him, the hallway stretched, and he remained small and out of reach. She woke with tears on her face and a weight in her chest she couldn't shake. Determined not to waste a single moment, she spent the next day researching Dr. Harold Ashbourne, Mr. Ashbourne's late father. If anyone held the key to Eli's fate, it was him. She found an old academic profile in a university archive. Dr. Harold Ashbourne had been professor of developmental psychology and behavioral sciences, publishing studies on predictive emotional behavior in children. Several of his papers had been co-authored with government researchers and carried cryptic references to a THO model. Janice didn't know what that meant, Not yet, but she recognized one of the journal names listed in the footnotes, a discontinued medical review called the Human Environment Observer. She drove to the state library the next morning, digging through microfilm archives until her eyes ached. And then there it was, a 10-page article titled The Limits of Empathy, Case Study Series on Controlled Childhood Variables, authored by Dr. Harold Ashbourne. The paper was dense, clinical, stripped of emotion, but buried in the technical jargon. She found chilling phrases. Subject 11 demonstrated heightened pattern recognition, strategic silence, and excessive emotional containment. Reassignment approved. Subject 9 showed unpredictable trauma response. Terminated. Janice's stomach turned as she flipped through each line. This wasn't research. It was experimentation. Children reduced to numbers. Reassignment could mean anything, and terminated didn't feel like relocation. It felt final. Her fingers trembled as she reached the final page of the article. There was no subject named, no summary of Subject 17, just a closing paragraph about the challenges of managing long-term variables and the necessity of institutional control. She left the library with copies of the article, a sick feeling in her gut, and a name echoing in her mind, Project THEO. That evening, as she returned to the estate for her regular shift, she noticed something odd. The front garden was being trimmed, but not by the usual groundskeeper. Two men in unfamiliar uniforms stood beside the truck, their jackets unmarked. They watched her car pull up. Neither smiled. Inside, the atmosphere had changed. Charles was more distant than usual. Amelia was nowhere to be seen. Janice worked her way through the first floor quietly, carrying her cleaning supplies, but her thoughts were already racing ahead. She knew now that she couldn't keep this to herself. Someone else had to know. Someone who could help. She needed Amelia. That night, she waited until most of the house had quieted, then made her way toward the servant quarters. She knocked softly at Amelia's door. A few moments later, it creaked open. Amelia looked pale, nervous. "We can't talk here," she whispered. "Meet me in the laundry cellar in 15 minutes. Janice nodded and walked away as if nothing had happened. 15 minutes later, she descended the stairs into the dimly lit basement where the washers and storage shelves lined the walls. Amelia was already there, her eyes darting toward the doorway. "I know you saw the portrait," she said quietly. "I saw you that day." Janice stepped closer. "Do you know who he is?" "I don't know his name," Amelia said, "but I know that room is more than what it seems. I once followed Charles when he thought I was off duty. He went into the east wing. I waited until he left. The room with the portrait. There's a cabinet with a false back. I saw it open once. There were files inside. A lot of them." Janice's breath caught. "Files?" Amelia nodded. "I didn't take anything. I was too scared. But they looked old and organized, like medical records. And there's something else below the mansion, a second basement. It's not on the floor plans. I found it by accident. There's a panel behind a wine rack that opens into a narrow staircase. It leads down. Wait, down. To what? I don't know, but I heard sounds. Machines, maybe, or recordings." Janice felt her knees weaken slightly. She had come looking for answers, but what she found was a door to something deeper, something far more sinister than she had imagined, and it was time to open it. The air in the mansion had grown heavy. It wasn't just the unease that had taken root in Janice's chest. It was something tangible now, something that hummed in the silence and stirred in the corners of every room she passed. After the conversation in the cellar with Amelia, the house no longer felt like a place of quiet wealth and order. It felt like a trap dressed in velvet and gold. The next morning, Janice arrived at the estate with her nerves strung taut. She didn't expect to see Amelia right away, and she was right. The young woman was nowhere in sight. Charles greeted her at the door, his eyes sharp, his mouth set in a straight line. He gave no instruction, no welcome, only a slow nod, then turned and disappeared into the west wing. Janice made her way through the hall with her cart, hands trembling slightly. She wasn't sure what she would do today, whether she would try to find a hidden passage behind the wine rack, or wait for another sign from Amelia, but something told her she had already crossed a line. There was no turning back. She had just begun to polish the frames along the main staircase when Charles appeared again. He didn't speak, only stood a few feet away, waiting for her to notice him. When she did, he gave her a look she couldn't quite place, part warning, part pity. "Mr. Ashbourne wishes to remind you," he said evenly, "that the East Wing is closed to all staff." Janice didn't look up from her cloth. "I understand." He paused and added, "and that it's best to let certain memories rest." Her hand froze over the frame. "Excuse me." Charles stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "You didn't see what you think you saw, Mrs. Reynolds. Sometimes the mind plays tricks, especially when it's burdened by old grief." She turned to face him now, the air between them brittle. "I know what I saw. I know who he is." Charles's expression didn't change, but his voice grew colder. "Then you should also know what it costs to stir up the past. People who go digging often find more than they bargain for." "Is that a threat?" "It's a reminder." He tilted his head slightly. "This house has history, some of it unpleasant, but not all of it is yours to carry." With that, he turned and walked away. Janice stood there for a long moment, heart racing. The conversation wasn't just a warning. It was a signal. They knew she had gone too far, and now they were watching her. The rest of the morning passed slowly. She moved through her tasks with robotic precision, her thoughts spiraling with every step. She caught glimpses of Mr. Ashbourne once or twice, but he did not speak. Amelia was still absent. When Janice asked another maid where she was, the girl shrugged and said Amelia had taken a few days off. Her tone suggested she didn't know why, or maybe she had been told not to ask. That afternoon, as Janice was scrubbing the tile in one of the guest bathrooms, she heard footsteps approach. She looked up, expecting another cold word from Charles, but it was one of the house's rarely seen chauffeurs, a man in his 40s, with a limp and a habit of wearing sunglasses indoors. He paused at the doorway, glanced behind him to make sure no one was nearby, and leaned in slightly. "You should go home early today," he murmured. "They're expecting someone important." Janice stood slowly. "What do you mean?" "Just trust me. Don't be here when they arrive." "Who?" But the man had already turned and was walking away. Janice didn't leave. She couldn't, not now. If anything, the warning had only sharpened her resolve. She finished her shift as normal, then waited in her car parked at the far end of the driveway, watching the estate through the rearview mirror as dusk settled over the grounds. Sure enough, just before 7 o'clock in the evening, a dark black sedan pulled up to the side entrance. Two men in suits got out. One was thin, gray-haired with a briefcase in hand. The other was taller, younger, and moved with the posture of someone used to authority. They didn't go to the main entrance. Instead, Charles met them at the side and let them in without a word. Janice waited 15 minutes, then drove off, but only far enough to turn into a wooded path near the back of the property, where she had seen service staff enter before. She parked behind a row of trees and cut the engine. The night was cold and still, the trees whispering above her as she stepped out, clutching a flashlight and the old photo of Eli she carried everywhere now. The back entrance was unguarded. She slipped into the laundry room and moved quietly toward the wine cellar. Her heart beat like a drum in her ears. She remembered Amelia's words, behind the wine rack, a panel. She scanned the rows of bottles until she found a section with faint scratch marks around the wooden frame. She pressed her hand along the edge and felt a click. A narrow panel swung open. Behind it, a staircase spiraled downward, carved into stone. She paused only long enough to catch her breath, then descended. The air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, the corridor leveled out and stretched ahead, dimly lit by overhead bulbs spaced far apart. She followed it slowly, her steps muffled against the cement floor. Doors lined the walls, old, heavy, steel-framed. Most were closed. One was ajar. She pushed it open. Inside was a room no larger than a hospital suite. A bed, a small desk, a chair bolted to the floor. Everything was stark, gray, institutional. But what caught her attention was a wall. covered in children's drawings, faded and pinned with rusted tacks. Birds, trees, a red paper crane. She stepped closer, hand over her mouth. These were Eli's. A shuffling noise echoed from deeper down the hall. Janice turned off the flashlight and backed into the wall, heart pounding. She heard footsteps, 2 sets, followed by muffled voices. Mayo, one older, one younger. She's been asking questions, the older one said. We need to make sure she stops. She's just a cleaner. Exactly. No one would miss her. The voices faded as the men passed by the corridor, unaware of her presence. Janice waited until the silence returned, then slipped out of the room and retraced her steps. She didn't breathe until she was back in her car, miles away from the estate. That night, she didn't sleep. She spread the drawings on her kitchen table, photographing each one, documenting the room, writing down everything she had heard. She no longer doubted that Eli had lived in that underground space, that he had drawn those pictures, that he had been kept there, and now she knew for certain. The mansion wasn't just a home. It had been a facility, a laboratory, and someone had gone to great lengths to keep its past sealed away. But Janice Reynolds was not going to be silent. Not now. Not ever again. The morning after discovering the underground room, Janice sat in her kitchen with a notebook open and the smell of burnt coffee lingering in the air. Her hands were sore from clutching the steering wheel all night, and her legs ached from crouching in that cold corridor, but her mind had never been more alert. The drawings she had photographed, Eli's birds, trees, and paper cranes, now filled her phone's memory. Each sketch was a key to a locked part of the mansion's past, a part someone clearly wanted to stay buried. She thought of the voices in the corridor. No one would miss her. They hadn't said her name, but the implication was unmistakable. She had crossed a line, but fear, once settled deep in her bones, had transformed into something else, defiance. She knew now there was more to find, and she knew exactly where to start. That day at the estate, she arrived at the usual time and greeted Charles with the same silent nod he had come to expect. But as soon as she stepped inside, she slipped into a pattern different from her usual route. Instead of starting in the main hall or the library, she took her cleaning cart down the west hallway and turned toward the mansion's old library, an area rarely used by guests and largely left untouched except for routine dusting. She waited until she was sure the staff was scattered throughout the house before carefully closing the library doors behind her. Her gloves muffled the sound as she pushed the cart against the door, securing it shut. The room was enormous, filled wall to wall with ancient volumes, cracked leather spines, and the faint smell of mildew. At the far end stood a built-in cabinet with glass doors, locked with a simple brass mechanism. But it wasn't the lock that caught Janice's eye, it was the dust. Someone had opened it recently. The faint marks of fingerprints were still visible on the glass. She retrieved a hairpin from her pocket, a habit left over from her youth, and began working the lock. It took 3 minutes in steady hands, but eventually the latch clicked and the doors creaked open. Inside were files, dozens of them, yellow paper, sealed envelopes, and hardbound folders labeled in thick black marker. Most were unlabeled or referenced generic titles, test notes, subject responses, progress reports. She flipped through them quickly until her eyes fell on one in the center of the stack, marked in faded red ink, Project THEO. Her heart skipped. She pulled the file out carefully and opened it across a wooden reading table, scanning the first page. The contents were as clinical and cold as the article she had read in the library archives. There were coded identifiers, Subject 13, Subject 9, Subject 17. No real names, but photos were attached. Blurred, grainy images of children in sterile rooms, sitting across from men in white coats. And then she found him. Eli. He was younger in the photo than she remembered, perhaps 8 years old, but the eyes were unmistakable. The file labeled him as Subject 17. There was a summary of his observed behavior, his high-level empathy response, his linguistic patterns suggesting advanced emotional regulation. The notes mentioned rapid adjustment, high social mimicry, and above-average resistance to stress in isolated settings. But it was the last page that chilled her most. Status: retained. Where other subjects had been marked, terminated, transferred, or rejected, Eli's entry was clean, singular, retained, as though he had passed a test that others failed, or endured something longer. She took photos of every page, her fingers trembling with each shutter sound. When she closed the file, she found another beneath it, this one labeled Environmental Simulation Trials, Phase 2. The opening line detailed a construction project beneath Ashbourne Estate, a living space designed to simulate controlled domestic environments for long-term observational analysis. A human lab, underground, hidden beneath a mansion that now hosted cocktail parties and formal dinners. Janice returned the files exactly as she had found them and relocked the cabinet. Before she left the room, she wiped down every surface she had touched, even the glass doors. She couldn't afford mistakes now, but her caution didn't save her from what came next. That evening, she parked her car outside her apartment and noticed the front door to her unit slightly ajar. She had locked it that morning. Her chest tightened. She approached slowly, turning the knob with the back of her hand. The lights inside were off. She stepped in and immediately noticed the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the threatening kind. The air had changed, cool, still, like a room waiting for something to happen. Her apartment hadn't been ransacked. Nothing was missing, but something was definitely wrong. She moved toward the kitchen, where a faint, acrid scent reached her nose. Burnt paper. When she turned on the light, her breath caught. The photograph of Eli, her only physical copy, had been burned in the sink. A scorched edge curled upward like a sneer. The ashes were still warm. She backed away, one hand over her mouth, the other fumbling for her phone. No message, no signs of forced entry. But the meaning was clear. This wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration. They knew she had the file. They knew she had seen the room. And now they were reminding her that nothing she owned was out of reach. That night, she didn't sleep. She stayed at a motel 2 towns away, changing her route twice to make sure she wasn't being followed. She uploaded all the photos she had taken to a secure online storage account, added passwords to everything, and wrote a detailed report summarizing every step she had taken so far. She sent a copy to her personal email and another to a trusted friend she hadn't spoken to in years, with instructions to open it only if she failed to make contact within 48 hours. Janice knew now that this was bigger than Eli, bigger than the Ashbourne family. Project THEO had been a full-scale psychological experiment, conducted in secret and protected by power and silence. Eli hadn't just been a subject. He had been the core of it, and for some reason, he had stayed in that mansion long after the others disappeared. But the question still haunted her. Where was he now? And why? After all these years, did his portrait still hang on the wall at a memory someone couldn't let go of? There were no more illusions left. Janice wasn't a cleaner anymore. She was a witness, a threat, and she was going to bring every secret into the light, no matter the cost. The following morning, Janice returned to Ashbourne Estate under the pale glare of overcast skies. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep, and her every step felt heavier than the last, as if the truth itself had begun to weigh on her bones. She kept her hands stuffed deep in her coat pockets, gripping a USB stick that held the only backup she dared carry with her. The photos from the Project THEO files, Eli's images, the notes about environmental simulation, and the scanned list from the orphanage. She had hidden the originals, but now she needed help. Real help. Someone inside. Amelia was the only name that came to mind. It had been nearly a week since she'd last seen the young maid, and Janice feared something might have happened to her. The girl's absence was too neatly timed with Janice's growing intrusion into the mansion's secrets. She moved through the house cautiously, cleaning and watching, searching for a sign. By mid-morning, she found it. She was in the laundry quarters, folding towels, when she noticed movement to the narrow window of the adjoining hallway. Amelia. She was walking quickly, clutching a tray, her head low. Janice dropped the towel and rushed into the corridor, intercepting her before she could disappear again. "Amelia," she said in a whisper, grabbing the girl gently by the elbow. Amelia flinched and pulled away before realizing who it was. Her eyes darted toward the security camera overhead, then back to Janice. Not here, Amelia murmured, barely moving her lips. Second floor, linen closet. 10 minutes. Janice nodded once and let her go. Exactly 10 minutes later, she climbed the back staircase to the second floor, her heart pounding. The linen closet was tucked near the guest rooms, rarely used during daytime hours. She slipped inside and closed the door behind her, surrounded by the scent of fresh cotton and aged wood. Amelia was already there, seated on an overturned storage bin, pale and tense. "I'm not supposed to talk to you," she said without preamble. "Charles told me you've been asking too many questions. He said I should keep my distance." Janice lowered her voice. "I understand, but I need your help. I've found files, records. I know what this house really was, what they did to Eli." Amelia looked up sharply. "Eli?" Janice nodded. "That's the boy's name, the one in the portrait. I used to care for him at the orphanage before he was taken. I've been trying to find out what happened to him ever since." Amelia's throat bobbed as she swallowed. "I didn't know his name. I found something. A drawer behind the portrait. A letter. I thought it was just a story, but it wasn't." Janice leaned in. "What did the letter say?" Amelia hesitated, then reached into her apron and pulled out a folded piece of aged paper. "I took it. I shouldn't have, but I couldn't stop myself. I read it over and over. It's written in a child's handwriting. I didn't understand it fully until now." Janice unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. Eli had written it himself, likely no older than 10 at the time. "They watch us all the time. Dr. Ashbourne says we're lucky to be chosen, but I don't feel lucky. The others cry at night. I don't. They like that I don't. I think it scares them. One boy disappeared last week. No one talks about it. I draw the bird so I don't forget what flying feels like." Janice felt her chest tighten with every line. "If anyone finds this, please tell Janice. She was kind to me. She made the thunder feel smaller." Janice's eyes filled, and her fingers trembled as she lowered the paper. "He remembered me," she whispered. Amelia's voice was quiet. "You were the only name he wrote." The silence between them was thick. Janice could hardly breathe. "There's more," Amelia said. "A passage behind the east wing stairwell. It doesn't go down, it goes sideways, into a walled section that isn't on any blueprint. I only found it because the floor creaked under my weight one day, and the panel shifted. There are rooms in there, Janice. Not like the others. Older, sealed off with locks from the outside." Janice's mind raced. "Did you go in?" "I opened one door. Just one. Inside were notebooks. Dozens of them. Some in children's handwriting. Others in medical shorthand. I didn't take anything. I was too afraid. But I can show you." "No," Janice said quickly. "Not yet. They're already watching me. If you go now, they'll suspect you too." Amelia nodded reluctantly. "Then what do we do?" Janice thought for a moment. "We get someone else involved. Someone outside this house. Someone who can expose what they've done." Amelia's voice dropped to a whisper. "Do you trust anyone?" "I don't know," Janice admitted, "but I can't do this alone anymore." They agreed to meet the next evening, once Janice had secured contact. She left the linen closet and resumed her duties, but her mind remained far from the cleaning supplies she carried. That night, back at her motel room, she opened her laptop and began searching through journalists she had followed for years, those who had written stories that no one else dared publish. She found one name that stood out: Laura Chun, investigative reporter, known for her work exposing corrupt child care institutions and private experimental research programs in the early 2000s. Her articles had led to 3 federal probes and the shutdown of 2 clandestine therapy facilities. Janice drafted an email attaching copies of files, the photos, and a summary of what she had found. She hesitated before hitting send, then typed the final line: "If you don't believe me, ask about Project THEO. Ask about Subject 17. Ask about Eli." She hit send. The next day, as she worked through her usual shift, her phone buzzed once. A new email from Laura Chun. "I believe you. Meet me tomorrow, noon. Public library, third floor, research wing. Bring everything. Janice stared at the screen for a long moment before tucking the phone back into her pocket. She had expected silence. Or worse, a warning. Not belief. Not a reply so direct and urgent. The walls around the truth were beginning to crack. And now, for the first time, Janice was not alone. Amelia's letter, Eli's words, the hidden rooms, the burned photograph. None of it had been for nothing. The silence that had ruled the Ashbourne estate for decades was breaking. Tomorrow, Janice would tell the world. The morning of the meeting with the reporter dawned cool and gray, the kind of day that seems to hold its breath before something happens. Janice arrived early at the public library, carrying her worn laptop bag and the flash drive containing every digital file and image she had managed to gather. She sat at a corner table on the third-floor research wing, half hidden behind shelves of dusty journals, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might betray her presence. The world had changed overnight. A line had been crossed. When Laurichin arrived a few minutes later, her presence was calm, professional, with a firmness in her voice that steadied Janice's nerves. Laura introduced herself quietly, asked a few preliminary questions, then took out a recorder and handed it to Janice. "Tell me how it started," she said simply, and Janice did. She recounted the orphanage, Eli, the portrait, the mansion, everything, her voice trembling only slightly. Laura listened, never interrupting, once pausing to note something on a tablet. Afterwards, Laura leaned back and regarded Janice with a serious expression. "This is big," she said. "Much bigger than one missing boy. I've been investigating programs like this for years, projects funded by private donors, operating in the shadows. If your documents are genuine, we may have enough here for an expose that reaches national attention." Janice exhaled, relief mixed with fear. They arranged to meet again that evening with the intent to go through the files together. Laura left with promise. She would quietly check the chain of authorship of the research and contact former colleagues of Dr. Harold Ashbourne. Janice left the library feeling lighter somehow, though the weight on her chest remained. She returned to the estate for her shift later that afternoon. The halls looked the same, the polish was gleaming, the chandeliers reflecting the soft light, but Janice saw it all differently now. Each door seemed like a barrier keeping something hidden. Each quiet room looked like a covering for consent she had never given. She worked methodically, but she kept glancing at the clock, aware that every minute brought her closer to tonight. As dusk gathered around the estate, she slipped away for a moment to the laundry quarters and found Amelia. The girl was pale, anxious, rubbing her hands together. Janice pulled her aside. "They followed me yesterday," Amelia whispered. "In a van. I saw it outside when I left the mansion at night. I think they watched your car, too." Janice's stomach dropped. "Did you take anything else in the rooms?" Janice asked. "I didn't." Amelia said, "I just looked, and I left, and they know we're digging." Janice placed a hand on Amelia's shoulder. "You were brave, but we need to be cautious." That evening, Janice and Laura met at a small diner in a nearby town. They sat in a booth against the wall, guarded by the murmur of other patrons. Laura passed Janice a secure hard drive and a burner phone. "We'll use this to communicate," she said. "And this will hold everything, your files, plus whatever I dig up from here." Janice accepted it, hands trembling slightly. They went to the files together, scrolling through the scans of Project Ticcio, the environmental simulation documents, the children's drawings pinned on the walls underground. Laura made notes. She looked up. "This is not just about missing children," she said quietly. "This is about how children were turned into subjects monitored and then hidden. And this estate, your employer's estate, is central." Janice swallowed. "I know." She looked at Laura. "What happens next?" Laura's expression darkened. "We're going public, but you'll be in danger from now on. When people have so much to lose, they fight back." Janice nodded, fear humming in her veins. But the fear no longer controlled her. On the drive home, Janice parked a little distance from her apartment and walked. She reached the building and found a folded note tucked under her windshield wiper. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper plain. It read, "Stop digging. For your own good, There was no signature. She stuffed the note into her coat and entered her unit. The light was off, curtains drawn, the same silence she had felt before. She turned on the lamp and sat, staring at the burner phone. It buzzed suddenly. A text message. "We are watching." No number, no name, just a threat. From that moment, the trap was set. Over the next few days, strange things happened. Janice's apartment buzzer rang at odd hours. She heard footsteps outside her door when she was in the bathroom. Her windows were checked for signs of deep shadows. A car paused at the end of her street and waited. She documented everything. Photographs of license plates, time stamps. She sent everything to Laura. One evening, as she approached the estate, she noticed the black sedan again, the same model she had seen before. It pulled away when she locked eyes with the driver. She entered the mansion with the cart, trying to appear casual. But inside, there was tension in the air that felt like static. That night, when the household had quieted, Janice revisited the laundry basement. She met Amelia, who had a panic in her eyes. "They're planning something," she whispered. "Tonight, in the East Wing." Janice's heart tightened. "What?" "I overheard them mention arrivals. From a facility, a transport. Upstairs staff were told to clear Corridor 52. Janice nodded. "Then we get the cameras running." Amelia shook her head. "There aren't cameras there, but there are motion sensors." Janice exhaled. "Then we record audio." They waited in the basement, recording whispering voices through the floorboards. Then a door opened above. Heavy footsteps. Janice's breath caught. Then silence. They left the basement and separated. Janice went upstairs and booked through the guest corridor toward the East Wing. She reached Corridor 52, an area she had never entered. A side door stood ajar. She pressed her ear to it. Inside, a low murmur of voices, orders being given, a man's voice. "Make the transfer." Subject retained. Janice's hand shook. She crouched back and slipped away. She returned to Amelia in the laundry room. "They're moving someone," she said. "Tonight." Amelia's eyes filled. "We need to alarm Laura." They used the burner phone. "Laura, we have movement. Transport preparations now." Laura replied, "Stay safe. I'm alerting my contacts." Then the line went silent. Janice left the estate and drove into the woods until she was certain she was unobserved. Then she called Laura back. Later, Janice returned to mansion, knowing that the trap was closing. And somewhere in the basement beneath the estate, the children's drawings still covered the walls, and the footsteps still came in the cold corridors of midnight transfer. Janice knew the next move would tip the balance, but the world was watching, and for the first time, she felt less alone. The morning after the failed transfer in Corridor 52, the Ashbourne estate settled into an uneasy calm. Outside, the fog rolled over the manicured grounds like a slow tide, wrapping the mansion in a pale shroud. Inside, the hall seemed quieter than usual. Janice sensed it immediately. The usual rhythm of staff movement had changed. There were fewer footsteps, fewer voices, no trace of the sedan from the night before. She moved carefully, staying alert to shifts in behavior. Charles was nowhere to be seen. Mr. Ashbourne had not emerged from his study. Even Amelia had vanished again, leaving Janice to finish their morning duties alone. Every corner of the house felt like a room with the air sucked out. But something had changed. She could feel it, not just in the atmosphere, but in the way the silence no longer seemed neutral. It was as if the mansion itself had witnessed something it could not forget. After completing her assigned tasks, Janice returned to the East Wing corridor where the transfer had nearly occurred. The side door they had seen open the night before was now locked. Still, she studied the floor. Tiny scuffs, traces of movement. The faintest smell of antiseptic lingered. She pressed her hand against the wallpaper. Cold. She turned to leave, but then her eyes caught something small and out of place, a fragment of dark paper near the baseboard. She crouched, picked it up. It was part of an envelope, torn, but there was a seal at the edge, a faded stamp from the Ashbourne family crest. Whatever letter it had once carried had been destroyed, but it had come from within the house. That night, Back at her apartment, Janice couldn't sleep. Her mind reeled with possibilities. She turned on the lamp, sat at the desk, and reviewed every file again. Her eyes landed on the list from the orphanage. Eli's name, coded as MC-17, had stood out since the beginning, but now she noticed another name, MC-19, no red X, no transfer note, just blank. She hadn't focused on it before. She opened her old journals and searched for entries from the same period. And then she found it. June 21st. A girl arrived today. Amelia. Quiet like Eli was. Maybe younger. She won't speak to anyone except him. They sit together during lessons, almost never apart. It's strange. She mimics the way he folds paper. They seem tethered. Janice's pulse quickened. She read the entry again, then turned back to the orphanage list. MC-17 Eli. MC-19 Amelia. She sat frozen for a long moment, her breath shallow. Could it be? She picked up her phone and called a burner number. Amelia answered after the third ring, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to see you, Janice said. Now. They met an hour later in a small, all-night coffee shop 2 towns away. Amelia looked tense, her eyes darting to the windows as if expecting someone to follow. Janice wasted no time. You lived at Mill Creek. You were there with Eli. Amelia didn't deny it. Instead, she nodded slowly, as if releasing something she'd held in for years. I didn't remember at first, she said. Not clearly. The memories come in pieces, like flashes. But the day I found the letter behind the portrait, it all came back. You were part of the same program. Janice said, Project Ticcio. You and Eli. We weren't just part of it, Amelia whispered. We were its final subjects. Janice stared. You were monitored together? They called us complimentary profiles. Amelia said, I don't remember much about what they did to us. Just moments. A room with white walls. A man asking us to draw while listening to static. Watching how long we'd sit without speaking. Eli always took the pain so I wouldn't have to. Her voice cracked. Janice reached across the table, her hand trembling. Amelia, do you know what happened to him? Amelia nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. They said he ran away, that he escaped through the woods behind the estate. That's what they told me when they pulled me out. But I never believed them. Not really. Not until I started working here and saw his face on the wall. Janice's eyes filled with tears. He left you? No. Amelia said, he saved me. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She unfolded it to reveal a single page, aged, creased. A drawing. A bird, wings spread, flying high above a forest. It was in my coat when they moved me. The last thing he gave me. I didn't know what it meant until I saw this place again. Janice took the page, her fingers trembling. She looked at Amelia. Why work here? Why come back? I had to know if he was really gone, if the story they told me was true. At first, I didn't recognize the house, but then everything came rushing back. Janice leaned back, overwhelmed. And now they know who you are. Amelia nodded. I've been hiding in plain sight, but they're starting to remember. Janice stared at her. You're not just a witness. You're family. Amelia looked down. He called me his sister. We weren't blood, but we were all each other had. And now they've tried to erase him. Erase all of it. Janice sat in silence for a long time. Then we expose everything, she said. Together. Amelia nodded. There's one more place we haven't checked. Behind the study. There's a hidden stairwell, built during the original construction. I overheard Charles mention it once. It leads to a storage vault beneath the estate. If they've hidden anything important, it's there. Janice's breath caught. Then that's where we go next. The past was no longer a mystery. Eli wasn't just a boy she once cared for. He was a thread that tied it all together. And now, Amelia, the girl who had walked the halls of Mill Creek beside him, was standing at her side. The truth had a pulse, and it was finally beginning to beat out loud. The day after the revelation in the coffee shop, Janice and Amelia returned to the Ashbourne estate under the guise of routine. Janice resumed her cleaning duties. Amelia resumed hers in the guest quarters. But beneath the silence, both women carried a single purpose like a hidden blade: to find the stairwell behind the study and reach the vault. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. Mr. Ashbourne remained confined to his study, and Charles moved through the halls like a figure from play, rehearsed and alert. No one spoke of the tension that pulsed through the mansion, but it was there, thick and humming. Janice used the late afternoon window when the household gathered for a formal dinner in the west dining room. She slipped away, pushed her cart toward the library, and waited by the study entrance until she saw Charles disappear down the hall. Without knocking, she turned the knob. The study was dim, lit only by the orange flicker of a fireplace. Mr. Ashbourne stood near the window, glass in hand, staring out into the fading garden light. He did not turn when she entered, but he spoke, his voice low, expectant. "I wondered how long it would take for you to return." Janice stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I've seen the files. I've read the research. I've spoken to Amelia." He turned now, sharply, the name cutting through the silence. "You've involved her?" She was always involved, long before either of us understood how deep this went. Mr. Ashbourne placed the glass down on his desk and moved toward her slowly, his eyes sharper now, colder. "You do not understand the scope of what you're meddling in, Mrs. Reynolds. You've uncovered fragments, debris from something long buried, but you do not have the full picture." "I don't need the full picture to know Eli was taken," Janice said. "To know he was kept here, observed, measured, treated like a test subject. I don't need your permission to call it what it was: abuse." His lips tightened. "What we did, what my father did, was part of a greater vision. You see chaos. He saw potential." "Potential?" she echoed bitterly. "In children? In shaping human behavior, in controlling variables that would one day influence society. Eli was an anomaly, a rare convergence of traits. Empathy without fragility, intelligence without ego. He fascinated my father." Janice's hands clenched. He terrified him. Ashbourne looked away for a moment, silent. "We tried to understand him," he said finally. "And when we couldn't, my father decided to keep him, to isolate him from external influence." "Where is he now?" "I don't know," Ashbourne said. "One morning years ago, he was gone. No broken doors, no forced entry, just vanished." "You're lying." He stepped closer. "I'm not. He disappeared, and we never found a trace. My father went mad searching for him, spent the last years of his life combing through security footage, tracking old staff. He believed Eli had help." Janice's heart beat faster. "Did he?" Ashbourne stared at her. "I think you already know the answer." A long pause stretched between them. "I have everything," Janice said. "Your father's research, the photographs, the journals, the letter Eli wrote. The public will know. You can't silence this." "You think the public cares?" Ashbourne said, voice rising. "You think outrage will rewrite history? These were sanctioned programs, quietly funded, buried under layers of legality. You'll be painted as unstable. A grieving woman with a savior complex. No one will listen." Janice stepped forward, close enough to meet his eyes fully. "They'll listen when Amelia speaks." Ashbourne went still. "She's not just a maid," Janice said. "She was subject 19. She remembers the white walls. She remembers Eli, and she's ready to speak." His jaw tightened. "Then she signs her own destruction." "No," Janice said. "She signs the end of your family's illusion." Without another word, she turned and walked out of the study. She found Amelia waiting by the corridor behind the library. Together, they slipped behind the shelves to a wall that appeared solid, until Amelia reached behind a carved wood panel and pressed a hidden lever. The wall clicked, then shifted open slightly. A narrow stairwell appeared beyond. They descended together, the air growing cooler with every step. The stone passage twisted sharply, leading to a thick steel door. Amelia reached into her coat and pulled out a key she had taken from Charles's office weeks ago. She fitted into the lock. The door creaked open. The room beyond was nothing like the sterile basement they had explored before. It was warmer, paneled in dark wood, with shelves of documents sealed in glass cases. A desk sat in the middle, with a projector, an old tape recorder, and rows of labeled reels. Janice stepped forward, scanning the files. One reel caught her eye. Subject 17, final session. She turned to Amelia, who nodded. Janice inserted the reel into the projector and turned it on. The machine whirred to life, and grainy black and white footage flickered on the wall. Eli appeared on screen. 10 years old, calm, seated at a table. A voice, distorted by time, asked him, "Do you know where you are?" "Yes," he said. "I'm in the room where they ask questions." "Do you know why you're here?" Eli hesitated. "Because I don't cry when I'm supposed to." The screen flickered. The voice continued. "Do you feel fear?" "No." "Do you dream?" "Yes." "What do you dream about?" Eli looked into the camera. "I dream about the day I'll walk out." The footage ended. Janice sat back, shaken. They had recorded everything. His defiance, his awareness. Amelia stood frozen. He was planning it. Even then. Janice nodded slowly. And maybe he succeeded. She turned toward the files, pulled out one labeled Exit Protocol, Contingency 17. Inside, a page outlined an emergency scenario. If Subject 17 escapes, the house enters lockdown. All external communication is restricted. All records are relocated to Vault B. But at the bottom, scrawled in a different hand, was a note. He didn't run. He was taken. We were too late. The woman knew. She took him. "Burn this page." Janice's breath caught. "The woman," she whispered. "He had help. Someone from the inside. She took him away." Amelia stared. "Who?" Janice flipped the page and found name. Her sister's. Margaret Reynolds. Janice stumbled back. "My sister. She worked at the orphanage. She left suddenly, without explanation. They said it was personal, a family matter." Amelia's eyes widened. "Your sister saved him." And just like that, the final piece slid into place. Eli had escaped, not alone but protected. And now, 30 years later, his name would no longer be a secret. Janice looked at Amelia. "Let's finish this." The revelation that Margaret Reynolds, Janice's own sister, had been the one to help Eli escape decades ago shook Janice to her core. For a long time, she sat in the vault beneath the Ashbourne estate, holding a file that bore her sister's name. Her hands trembled, not just from shock, but from the sheer weight of what it all meant. Margaret had vanished from her life almost 30 years ago, after a sudden and unexplained departure from the orphanage. Janice had assumed it was due to illness, perhaps a nervous breakdown, maybe something unspoken between them. She had never pressed. But now, the truth stared her in the face. Margaret had risked everything to save Eli. Beside her, Amelia remained silent, her expression unreadable. She had spent her life surrounded by shadows she couldn't name. Now she had names: Margaret, Eli, Harold Ashbourne, and pieces of a childhood that had never made sense. Her hands were clenched in her lap as she stared at the flickering light from the reel projector. Janice finally spoke. "My sister, she must have stayed in contact with him after they disappeared. Or tried to, but I never saw them again. She died in a car crash." That's what the police said. No one else in the car. Just her. I always thought it didn't make sense, but I didn't question it. Amelia looked up. "And now you know why." Janice nodded slowly. "They must have found her. Eventually. But not him," Amelia said. "He got away. She made sure of it." Janice looked back at the files, at the scratched notes and warnings stamped across the pages. Retained. Non-compliant. Removed before Phase 3. She exhaled sharply. He escaped, but they never stopped searching. Amelia stood and paced the room, her hands curled into fists. "So what now? We found the proof. We found the link. But where is Eli? Where did he go after she saved him?" "I don't know," Janice said, "but I know how to find out." They packed the files into 2 satchels, one to keep, one to send. Before leaving the vault, Janice paused at the edge of the room and pulled a small envelope from her coat pocket. Inside was a note she had written that morning after confronting Ashbourne. She placed it on a projector and left it there. To whoever finds this, his name was Eli. He was not a subject. He was not a variable. He was a boy, and now the world will know. They emerged from the secret stairwell just before sunrise. The estate was still asleep, bathed in a pale morning light that seemed far too peaceful for what had been uncovered in its depths. They exited through the service corridor and drove to the city, avoiding the highway, taking back roads and changing directions several times. Janice was no longer just hiding information. She was moving with the precision of someone who knew she might be hunted. By 9 o'clock that morning, they were sitting in a downtown cafe across from Laura Chun. The journalists listened in stunned silence as they explained what they had found. When Janice passed her the folder with Margaret's name inside, Laura's hands paused mid-turn. "We have enough," she said. "More than enough. But this," she tapped the file, "this is the heart of it. This changes the story from institutional neglect to coordinated removal, from silent observation to active suppression. I need you to tell his story," Janice said. "All of it, from the beginning." Laura nodded. "And I will. But I need names, records, someone who can go on the record. The files are important, but they're evidence. What I need now is testimony." Amelia looked up. "Then I'll speak." Janice turned to her, eyes wide. "Are you sure?" "I have nothing to lose," Amelia said quietly. "And I think it's time people knew who I really am." Laura pulled out a recorder and began asking questions. Amelia recounted her earliest memories. White walls, cold floors, whispering through vents, Eli's voice comforting her in the dark. She described the experiments, the isolation, the way the staff referred to them only by number, and then she described the day Eli disappeared, the confusion, the silence that followed, the lie they told her, that he had been relocated to another family. After an hour, Laura turned off the recorder. "This will shake everything," she said. "But I need time. A few days. I'll go to my editor. I'll vet the files, double-source every detail, and then I'll publish it all." They agreed to meet again once the story was ready. Janice and Amelia returned to the motel they'd checked into under false names. They drew the curtains tight and kept the lights low. Every hour that passed felt like a rope tightening or loosening. Janice spent most of the evening going through Margaret's old letters, one she hadn't read in years. She found one dated 6 months before Margaret's death. "I found something beautiful in the chaos. A boy who knows more about the world than any adult I've met. I'm not sure how to protect him, Janice, but I know I must try." Janice read the line over and over again until her tears blurred the ink. By the 3rd day, Laura called. The article was written. The editor had greenlit the story. They were going live at midnight. That night, Janice sat in front of a laptop in the dim motel room, Amelia beside her. As the clock struck 12, Laura's voice came through a recorded interview released by the news outlet. The Ashbourne Files, inside the mansion that held a generation of forgotten children. The article was long, filled with images, timelines, scans of the research files, photos of the underground rooms, Eli's drawings. It included Amelia's testimony and quotes from Janice. It named names, cited institutions, tracked funding. The Project THEO model was finally exposed for what it was. By morning, the media storm had begun. News anchors discussed it with furrowed brows. Hashtags trended. Lawmakers called for inquiries. And the Ashbourne name, once whispered with reverence, was now spoken with accusation. Mr. Ashbourne released a short, defiant statement claiming ignorance of his father's actions. But the evidence said otherwise. Investigators swarmed the estate. The vault had been empty before they arrived, but Janice had already provided copies of everything. More importantly, survivors began to come forward. 3 adults from other orphanages contacted Laura's outlet, claiming they remembered similar programs. And while none remembered Eli directly, Their descriptions of underground rooms, numbered clothing, and routine evaluations matched what Amelia had described. But the most shocking revelation came not from a journalist or a witness, but from a DNA test. Janice had submitted a sample of Amelia's to a private service a week earlier, hoping for any remaining trace of Eli. The results arrived 2 days after the story went live. Eli was not her brother. He was her father. Janice stared at the report in disbelief. He was just a child, she whispered. He should have had to. He was 10. Amelia's voice was quiet. It must have happened right before he vanished, before Margaret took him. Maybe she didn't know. Maybe she did. Janice looked at her, seeing her differently now, not as a witness, not just a survivor, but as a legacy. You are his daughter. Amelia nodded, her eyes misting, and they kept me close. All these years, I worked in the house that tried to erase him. They used me to bury him deeper. Janice put a hand on her shoulder. Not anymore. They sat in silence, the weight of it all pressing down. But beneath that weight, something had changed. A truth long buried had risen, and nothing would silence it again. The days that followed the public release of Laura Chen's article were a whirlwind. Janice watched in the shadows as the world responded. Some with outrage, others with disbelief, and many with a painful kind of recognition. The story of the Ashbourne estate, once a symbol of wealth and aristocracy in Massachusetts, was now known as the epicenter of one of the most disturbing psychological experiments of the late 20th century. Project THEO had become a household name overnight. But despite the headlines and interviews and panels filled with analysts speculating on the ethics of child behavioral conditioning, Janice knew the truth wasn't finished revealing itself. There were still too many unanswered questions. Chief among them was Eli, his final whereabouts, the full story of his disappearance, and what had truly become of him after Margaret took him away. Amelia was processing the discovery of her true identity in silence. She withdrew for a few days, not out of fear but to reflect. The knowledge that Eli had been her father shifted her world. Janice gave her space, trusting that when she was ready, she would return. Janice, however, remained active. She received dozens of emails from former staff at Mill Creek and other institutions mentioned in the files. Many were frightened, hesitant to go public, but several agreed to speak to Laura. One name, though, stood out from the rest: Dr. Norman Keyes, a former assistant to Harold Ashbourne during the late stages of Project THEO. Laura and Janice arranged a discreet meeting with Dr. Keyes at a retirement home on the outskirts of Albany. He was in his late 80s, frail but lucid. When they arrived, he greeted them with wary eyes and a cane in one hand. His room was sparse, with a single bookshelf, a bed, and a small television playing on mute. I knew someone would come, he said as they Saturday, eventually. Laura introduced herself, then gestured to Janice. She worked at the orphanage. She knew Subject 17 before any of this began. Dr. Keyes nodded slowly. Eli. Janice leaned forward. You knew him? I helped document him, the old man said. More than that, I interviewed him dozens of times. I wasn't one of the decision makers. I was just a pair of hands. But I knew what was being done was wrong. My wife begged me to leave. I didn't, not until after the night he vanished. You were there? Janice asked. Keyes looked down at his hands. I was on the night shift. Security detail was lighter than usual. I remember hearing something through the hall vent. Saw footsteps. Maybe, at first, I thought it was just one of the others. But when I got up to check, I found 2 of the cameras disabled, and the door to the eastern service tunnel cracked open. He paused. I followed the passage and saw a figure at the far end, a woman, holding a boy by the hand. She looked back once. I only caught her silhouette in the flashlight. I think she knew I wouldn't stop her. Janice's voice shook. That was my sister. Dr. Keyes nodded. I believe it. She wasn't on any schedule. No shift. No clearance. She came because someone let her in. Janice leaned back, absorbing the confirmation. Laura asked, Did you ever report it? I didn't have to, he said. The house knew. The next morning, the files were scrubbed, the cameras erased. Harold went berserk. He made calls, paid people. Within a week, every mention of Subject 17 was wiped from the internal logs. We were instructed to move on with Phase 2. Janice swallowed. What was Phase 2? Keyes looked at her with tired eyes. Recruitment. He handed them a small notebook. It was yellowed with age, but each page was neatly written. Names, dates, orphanage locations, asterisks next to certain initials. They wanted replacements. The idea was to find children with similar profiles, empathy, resilience, cognitive flexibility, and recreate the conditions that shaped Eli. They believed he had become something unique, something manufactured. They wanted to reproduce the results. Janice flipped through the names, finding some she recognized. Amelia's was among them. Laura took the notebook carefully. Why give this to us? Keyes let out a slow breath. Because I'm dying, and I can't leave this world carrying that weight. I watched what they did. I said nothing. I thought I was just following orders. But you can only stay quiet for so long before your silence becomes complicity. As they left, Janice paused at the doorway. Did he ever contact you? Eli. Keyes shook his head. Not me, but I heard rumors that he was seen years later. Older, living quietly somewhere on the coast, but no one could confirm it. Janice nodded. It was more than she had before. Back at the motel, Amelia returned. Her eyes were steadier now. I want to help, she said. Tell me what to do. Janice handed her a copy of the names from Keyes' notebook. We're going to find the others. Over the next week, Janice and Amelia contacted the individuals marked in the old notebook, many of whom were now adults scattered across the country. Some denied ever being involved. Some hung up the phone. But 3 agreed to speak. One, a woman named Clarice, lived in Vermont. She had fragmented memories of being part of a strange program in her childhood, lessons that involved being isolated in rooms, responding to visual stimuli while monitored. She remembered being told that if she succeeded, she would be chosen. But one day it all stopped. She was moved to a foster family and never heard from the program again. Another, a man named Devin, had a scar on his wrist from a restraint he couldn't explain. He recalled a boy with dark hair who used to hum while drawing birds. He had forgotten name. But when Janice showed him the portrait of Eli, his face changed. That's him, he said. That's the one they watched. The final subject, a man named Jonah, refused to go on record but sent a handwritten note to Laura's office. It read, "We survived something unnatural. You're right to bring it to light. But don't assume the people behind it are gone. They're not. They just changed their names." With these testimonies, Laura prepared a second article, a follow-up detailing the expansion of Project THO beyond the Ashbourne estate. She tied in the testimonies, the notebook, and Dr. Keyes' confession. She interviewed legislators and psychologists, experts in childhood trauma and institutional ethics. The second article published with greater reach than the first. National inquiries began. By the end of the month, congressional subpoenas were issued. Institutions listed in the files were placed under review. Janice was asked to testify before a federal panel. She agreed, but requested anonymity. Amelia, however, chose to speak openly. "My name is Amelia, and I was part of Project THO," she said at the televised hearing. "I didn't understand what they were doing to us then, but I do now. We were not just children. We were data. We were subjects. And we were left to disappear when the world stopped watching." The room fell silent. Her words echoed beyond the chamber. The world now knew the full truth. And Janice, watching from a monitor in the quiet of her room, whispered softly, "They didn't forget you, Eli. Not anymore." The Ashbourne estate stood quiet beneath the fading amber of late autumn, its once proud walls now stripped of their mystery and burdened by the truth. In the weeks following the hearings, the mansion had undergone a transformation, not of architecture, but of purpose. The east wing, once sealed and shadowed, had been reopened. No longer a site of secrets, it had been repurposed into something unexpected, a memorial gallery. It was not a decision made lightly. There had been considerable debate. Activists wanted the estate demolished. Others believed it should remain untouched, a frozen monument to what had been uncovered. But Janice, when asked, suggested something different. "Let them see it," she had said. "Let them walk the halls. Let them stand where silence once ruled. Let them know what was done, and who it was done to." And so the estate was open to the public, not as a museum of fine art or wealth, but as a space of remembrance. Survivors of Project THCO contributed what they could: testimonies, drawings, pages from notebooks, fragments of their youth that had been taken and twisted. Architects preserved the underground corridor, reinforcing it for safety while leaving the original textures intact. Visitors would be able to see the rooms where children were kept, read the notes scribbled by researchers, and listen to interviews playing quietly from speakers embedded in the walls. At the heart of the new gallery, in what had once been the portrait room, a change had taken place. The original portrait of Eli remained on the wall, exactly where Janice had first seen it. But beside it, a new portrait had been hung, commissioned by a young artist who had read the story and reached out to Amelia. This new painting was unlike the first in tone or intention. Eli was no longer a 10-year-old boy alone in a gilded frame. He was portrayed as a young man, his hazel eyes no less soft, but wiser, steadier. Beside him stood two figures: Amelia, her expression proud but tempered by grief, and Janice, with one hand resting gently on his shoulder. The three were not bound by blood in the traditional sense, but their connection had been forged in something deeper: survival, sacrifice, and truth. On the day the gallery opened, Janice arrived just before noon. The sky was overcast, and the wind carried a chill that hinted at the winter to come. She wore a dark coat, the same one she'd worn on the day she first entered the Forbidden Wing. Inside, the air was quiet. A few visitors moved slowly through the exhibits, reading the mounted testimonies, pausing at the cases filled with children's drawings. She saw a man in his 60s weeping silently as he looked at a photo of the underground corridor. A young mother held her daughter's hand, explaining what the word resilience meant as they stood before Amelia's statement. Janice made her way to the portrait room alone. She paused at the threshold, her eyes drawn immediately to the two canvases, the original and the new, the past and the present. The room was still, save for the sound of her footsteps as she crossed to the center. She stood before Eli's image and let her eyes linger. The same face, the same eyes, the same quiet strength. She had spoken his name in public for the first time only weeks ago. Now, his name was engraved in bronze below both portraits. Eli remembered, respected, never forgotten. Amelia joined her not long after. She stood beside Janice without saying a word for a while, their silence filled with things that no longer needed to be spoken aloud. "Do you think he'd be proud of us?" Amelia asked finally, her voice soft. Janice nodded, her throat tight. "I think he'd be glad we kept our promise." They remained there, 2 generations shaped by a boy whose life had been nearly erased. But not anymore. Later, when most of the crowd had cleared, Janice stepped to the small podium set up for speakers. A modest microphone, a few rows of chairs. Not many had stayed for closing remarks, but that didn't matter. She wasn't there for applause. She spoke slowly, her voice clear and even. When I first saw Eli's portrait, I thought I was losing my mind. I thought I was the only one who remembered him. But memory is a powerful thing. It survives denial. It survives silence. And sometimes, if you fight hard enough, it survives history. She paused, letting the words settle. This house was built to contain legacy. For decades, it succeeded. But no structure, no matter how ornate, can hold back the truth forever. Amelia joined her at the end of the speech, and together they stood by the portrait as visitors passed through. Some left flowers, others left notes. One young girl placed a red paper crane on the table beneath Eli's frame, unaware that he had once folded the same birds to fight off fear. As evening settled and the last guest drifted away, Janice walked one final circuit through the gallery. She passed the drawings, the files, the photographs, and then returned to the portrait. She stood before it, hands clasped, eyes shining. "You were never forgotten," she whispered. "And now they'll all know your name." Outside, the light was fading. But inside, in the room where Eli's face watched over them all, the light remained. Soft, steady, unyielding, the truth had found its voice, and it would echo forever.